Hello and welcome to Epochs of the Lotus Eaters. I am Connor. Today I've been graciously invited by Bo for episode 111 to discuss Lucky Luciano and the Commission. Thanks very much for this.
Yeah, no worries. Happy to have you on. Want to do an Epochs with everyone in the office if possible at some point. So thought we could talk about where we've talked with each other in the office about shared interests, and the mafia came up. The mob, the history of the mafia.
Not just because I'm part Irish, just so you know.
The Sicilian, Italian mobsters. I'm particularly interested in the old school stuff, like some of the first Mustache Petes, they'd call them, some of the first immigrants from Sicily and Italy that came over at the end of the 19th century. So I'm interested in all of the mafia history. But I thought we could do Charles Lucky Luciano, his real name Salvatore, but Lucky Luciano, because he's I think he's a good place to start, even though it's not at the beginning of the story, and I will go back and tell about some of the guys before him. But I think he's a great place to start because, well, arguably, and lots of people do say, he's sort of the number one greatest gangster of all time.
Yeah, he's one of the linchpins at the centre of the five families.
He put together the Commission. We'll get into exactly what all that was. I mean, you could say he put the organised in organised crime. You know, in my opinion, he blows someone like Al Capone out of the water in terms of sort of what he achieved and things. But just before we get into that and the details and the events and the dates and all sorts of things, I did just want to get real judgy real quick and just pass some judgment on it. I want to make it clear that although I'm fascinated by this stuff, I'm fascinated by loads of people in history who are monsters. I do think that gangsters and organised criminals and mobsters are scumbags.
Oh yeah, they're reprehensible. Yeah.
They're filth. They're absolute filth. Even modern ones. Like, I'm fascinated by Sammy the Bull. You know, Sammy the Bull Gravano. He's got a podcast. I hang on his every word, almost. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But I think he's a scumbag.
Yeah.
Sammy. You're a horrible, horrible individual. Terrible individual. If everyone lived like that, there would be no civilization. Anyone that uses intimidation and violence to shake people down. Pimps. One of the worst things you can do in the world is be a pimp, for example. I don't think Sammy the Bull was involved in that particularly, but, you know, the mob in general. Yeah,
but there is a kind of culturally lionising attitude, particularly in the black community, that pimping is a good thing to do. It's things like that, just degrade social fabric. Not good.
It's the absolute one of the worst things a man could possibly do. You're barely a man if you're a pimp. I think there's a line, isn't there, in Taxi Driver, where he says, "Be a man, don't be a pimp." Yeah, I think that's quite a good line. Anyway, organised crime. And just to touch on it a bit further on that, there's a line in Goodfellas when Henry Hill says something like, the normal people, the normal, like, button down normal person that goes to work and pays their taxes, they're like half dead. They're like nothing. But they're like the gangsters that take whatever they want. They're sort of great. They're wise guys. They're good fellas. It's like, well, I just couldn't disagree more.
Well, that's why I like the Scorsese films, actually, because I feel like he presents at the start of his films, particularly Goodfellas or The Departed, there is a sort of fraternalism or family or a celebratory aspect to the culture. It feels like they're real men's men. And then by the end, half of them have been bumped off, half of them betrayed each other. And even at the end of Goodfellas, he's basically living in perpetual hiding because he's ratted everyone out. And it's like, right, well, this life doesn't lead to a life of peace. You might slap each other on the back in the middle of a restaurant and have a good cackle for one time. But when your mates end up dead and you're hiding coke in the walls, it's probably not the best route to go down.
He says he has to live the rest of his life like a schnook.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're a criminal, an organised criminal, there's a very, very, very small chance you end up dying of old age of natural causes rich. Tiny, tiny chance of that. You'll almost certainly end up getting pinched or killed at some point.
Or whacked, yeah.
Right. So if that's what you want to do with your life, fair enough. And also you will have left human misery in your wake as well. So... but there you go. Some people decide to live their life like that. I don't think I could sleep at night if I knew I'd caused fear and misery and death in my wake. I just wouldn't want to do that. regardless of how much money or even women it might get you or something. But there is that thing, like with a lot of Scorsese films, there's like sort of the gangster chic that on some level as well, at the same time, it is cool on some level, of course. So Luciano, Charles Lucky Luciano, said once as a younger man, he said, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but I think these are his words. He said, "I'd rather be dead than be a crumb." A crumb is like a very old-fashioned word for to be a loser, a crumb bum, a stumble bum. It just means being a loser.
Yeah.
It means being weak and just doing as you're told. He says, "I'd rather be dead than live like that." Okay, fair enough. So yeah, the likelihood of you dying of old age, of natural causes, rich, being a gangster is highly, highly unlikely. Crime nearly always doesn't pay. And in fact, the only people that usually do end up extremely wealthy and at liberty are particular types of bosses right at the very top. But Lucky Luciano didn't actually get away with it. He's one of the few of these very, very senior bosses of his time that actually did end up getting pinched. But we'll get into the story of all that. But he's sort of thought of as the chairman of the mob in all sorts of ways. But we'll get into the commission. Shall I first go through sort of his early life and sort of the first part of his life, how it went down? Okay, so he was born in Sicily, a little town outside Palermo. So both his mother and father were Sicilian. So that is important because to be accepted into the American mob at the highest levels back then, you did need to be. They didn't open up the books, so to speak, until like the 70s, I think. So you had to be sort of full-blooded Sicilian, and he was. He came over in about 1907, I believe it was, when he was about 10 years old. Now that's a story, just like Vito Corleone in The Godfather. Vito Corleone, the Godfather, in the Godfather films and book, is an amalgam of loads of different stories. There's loads of different people that you can see are reflected in that character. But the story of sort of Italian and Sicilian, not just that, but sort of Polish, all sorts of immigrants, Irish, coming over to America around the turn of the century, the 20th century. So yeah, I just right there. There's one parallel with Vito Corleone and the fictional Vito Corleone and Salvatore Luciano straight away.
There's something interesting that Thomas Sowell wrote in Race and Economics, actually, and he said that proportionate to immigrant population, the Irish and Italians were massively underrepresented in organised crime versus the Jews were proportionally overrepresented, which is quite interesting. And I've heard it said one of the reasons for that, I know it's a slight tangent, but it's because of police profiling, so that if an Italian was seen fleeing the sound of a shooting, he'd get stopped. If a Jewish guy was seen fleeing it, they'd just assume he was an innocent bystander making a break for it. So that's why they were quite successful.
Yeah, I don't know why he said that. You say Thomas Sowell said that?
Yeah.
Oh, right. I don't know. I guess I don't know the breakdown well enough to disprove that. It seems like the Jewish thing he said there sounds about right. But as far as I can tell, the Italian and Irish, in New York anyway, were sort of the main organised crime syndicates.
Oh, they were the main, but as in like proportionate to the amount of immigrants that came in.
Oh, right. Okay.
The actual criminals among the immigrant population was lower versus the amount of Jewish immigrants that came in and were involved.
Okay, maybe.
Which isn't what's shown out in like Scorsese movies in The Departed or in Goodfellas, for example. It's just interesting.
Yeah, as a population of a whole, massively overrepresented. They're like the main ones. It's actually a funny, quick little point to make is that quite often organised crime and sort of shakedown money, intimidation money, quite often immigrants do it to themselves first and foremost. They extort and intimidate their own first.
Well, if you set up a satellite community, it's the easiest way to police yourselves, isn't it?
Well, in fact, that's one of the things that Luciano did, first of all, when he was a small child. He sort of dropped out of school very early because he wasn't obviously academically minded. One of the first things he'd start to do is go around to sort of the Italian street vendors and shake them down, even sort of as a child or a teenager. Or he'd go to Well, let's start the story. When he was young, we don't know exactly when, but when he was a kid, basically, somewhere around 12, 14 years old, something like that, he was shaking down some Jewish kids for protection money. Literally, like, you give us 5 cents a week or we'll beat the hell out of you. And that, you just see what the older people are doing and you copy them, don't you, I suppose?
Lunch money Luciano, yeah.
And this one kid, he was a small kid, Jewish boy, said, like, no, go fuck yourself. No way. Like, I'll take the beating, whatever you got to do. I'm not giving you a penny. No way. And this quite often happens, well, not often, but it sometimes happens. The Sicilian kids were like, oh, well, I appreciate your moxie. Obviously didn't say that, but they were like, oh, well, you've got balls, kid. Anyway, that turned out to be Meyer Lansky.
Oh, right. Wow.
So they met very early on when they were kids.
Right.
And we'll get into the story of Meyer Lansky later, because he and Luciano's relationship is absolutely key. It sort of sets the tone for organised crime for the 20th century. Their relationship with each other was became very, very, very close. And they were two, I hesitate to use the word geniuses, but at what they were doing, they were a type of genius. They were very, very successful at it. And they met very early on. Literally in the street, like that. Okay, so at some point, it seems Luciano got involved in all sorts of street crime and shenanigans, just all sorts of things. Apparently, again, when he was still a child, basically, he had some sort of small business where he would go around delivering hats for people. Again, we're talking the 1910s, pre-World War One, World War One sorts of time. But he was also just delivering heroin from this hat box.
Well, you can sort of commend the entrepreneurial spirit, but perhaps not what he was selling. I mean, most of the kids in my school sold Freddos, not quite as hard smack as that. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so heroin. One thing to say about that is that at different times and different places in the world, it's more or less prevalent. So perhaps in our world, in Britain, in the 1980s and 90s and even the modern day, it's not all that rare. In America, from the sort of 70s onwards, it wasn't particularly rare. But back then, it was kind of rare. And anyway, apparently Luciano got a little bit of a habit. We're not sure exactly if it was just smoking opium. It probably wasn't sort of intravenous train spotting type heroin. Probably would have been just chasing the dragon opium type stuff. But who knows? Anyway, seems to have got some sort of drug habit. He first got arrested when he was 18 years old for heroin. And when his parents found out, they sort of were extremely embarrassed. Not exactly disowned him, but they didn't. He went to prison for like 1 year, I think, and his parents didn't ever go and visit him. They were really ashamed by it. It's quite often you see in like gangster movies that although these are sort of tearaways doing some of the most morally wrong things you can do, really disgustingly violent things, they still want to appear to be a good boy for their ma.
Yeah, there's an internal honor system.
Yeah.
It's like who's the brother in The Godfather? The one that rats him out. The Weasley guy.
Well, he gets killed
in the second
spoiler.
one. Well, yeah, spoiler for a 40-year-old film.
What's the character's name? I can't remember.
That's really annoying because he is the number one. He's like next to Judas as the number one sellout. But yeah, the reason that is Michael bumps him off is because he's betrayed the family. Like he's known to be an embarrassment throughout all the things he does. When he hires the prostitutes in the first one, he's known to have kind of shown them up by being a bit crass, and they know he's a liability. And then eventually, when they find out he's sold out the family to the feds, boom, that's it.
Fredo,
that's it. Yeah. Fredo. That's annoying because I referenced Fredo the Frog earlier. So yeah,
it's funny they call little Chrissy Cuomo Fredo, don't they?
Yeah,
yeah. It's like the pathetic younger brother. Yeah, pure embarrassment. Yeah. So in some gangster circles, in fact, let's get onto that right away. There were these older 19th century gangsters, Sicilian gangsters that ran organised crime in New York. They called them Mustache Petes. And they were a lot more sort of, I don't know if the word's straight-laced, but they had a lot more sense of honour There are certain lines you don't cross. They're a lot more formal in their speech, things like that. A lot more formal in their dress. They weren't really Americanized. So for example, many of those older bosses, the Mustache Petes, didn't even speak English, or barely spoke English. Of the Genovese family, one of the original bosses was Giuseppe Morello. Sometimes called the Old Fox, or sometimes it's called the Clutch Hand, because he'd had some sort of on one of his hands he only had one finger. He was missing loads of fingers off one hand, and I'll put a picture up so people can see why it was called that. And he got sort of usurped a bit for the boss of his own crime family by a Masseria, a guy called Giuseppe Masseria, or Joe the Boss. He ended up being called Joe the Boss. Now, Joe the Boss, Giuseppe Masseria, was sort of a classic. He's sort of a classic example of a Mustache Pete. It's like he's not really Americanized in any way, and he's sort of that very old school Cosa Nostra, our thing, our family, very closed, very formal, very, not like the way it got completely corrupted and bastardized by the 1980s, say. Someone like John Gotti. It's like nothing like that. Nothing like that. It's really old school sort of, yeah. So anyway.
He wasn't running it like a corporation, he was running it like a family firm.
Yeah, right. And making money wasn't necessarily the main thing.
Yeah, it's just the means to the end.
Yeah, right. Could leave money on the table not for no good reason, but for just they had other concerns. But by the time Luciano is in that gang. He joined when he's younger, before he gets involved in the actual mob itself. He joins the Five Pointers, sort of a feeder gang. That's probably not quite the right way of putting it. But even Sammy the Bull talks about, before he was sort of inducted into the mafia, he'd been sort of a smaller street gang of kids, basically, and they would have deference to the actual mobsters, and hopefully one day they'd let you into their gang. So that's a bit the same even then. Luciano was in the Five Pointers. But eventually he gets into sort of the Genovese crime family, where Joe the Boss is the boss there. Just to mention another quick character, there was an underboss there called Vincenzo Terranova. And he was from Corleone in Sicily. Is it in Sicily? Yeah, he's in Sicily, of course, yeah. Corleone. And he ended up getting killed. They called him the Tiger of Harlem. He ended up getting killed in a drive-by. And I think, like I say, Vito Corleone is a mixture of loads of different people. But if there's one there where he actually comes from Corleone and got gunned down in a drive-by, just like in the film.
Yeah, because that's how Sonny dies in the first one, isn't it?
Yeah, well, Vito, he doesn't get killed, does he? But he's just on the streets of New York, and a family drive by and shoot him badly, but he doesn't actually kill him, does it? But there are five families, the five families of New York: the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Genoveses, the Bonanos, and the Colombos. And it's in the turn of the 20th century that these sort of really emerge. There's like Joe Profaco was the Colombo sort of originator. Niccolo Schiro was the sort of the first Bonanno guy. Tommy Galliano was the Lucchese sort of founder, if you want. Vincent Mangano was one of the first Gambino guys. Obviously, Carlo Gambino himself gave his name to it. But a lot of these gangs or families, they were sort of already a thing, and then a particular boss or leader would come along and give his name to it. So, like today, for example, the Genovese family, that if you go on Wikipedia, it will say that Luciano was in, but it wasn't called that in his time. Vito Genovese came after him, but yet historians sort of track it back and say that's like sort of the progeniture of the Genovese family. Anyway, these things are quite complicated. And there's loads of, and they overlap sometimes. Like Sammy the Bull was in, he was in the Gambinos to begin with. He switched over. He was in the Colombo family to begin with, and they sort of swapped him over to the Gambinos for like political reasons and stuff. So that's sort of fairly rare to do that. Back in the old days, I don't think they do that very much or at all. But anyway, let's carry on with Luciano's story. So he's like this street kid who gets arrested at 18. When he's about 26, he gets arrested again for, dealing heroin. And it seems that he, in order to not do loads of time, he ratted. He was a rat. He ratted on some of his partners in it, who happened to be Jewish. And the police, on the strength of his tip, they found a car where its trunk was full of heroin, and loads of people went down for that. But Luciano himself got away.
That as well is one of the only. I mean, crime won't necessarily pay because a lot of your earnings would be confiscated. But that's one of the only way that some of the gangsters make it out of it alive is they just turn on their co-conspirators and try and cut a deal with the feds. And that only works for a very minute few as well, because the rest, especially in the 20s through the 40s, got a seat on Old Sparky a lot of the time.
yeah. I mean, that only came out later, and we'll get to the point when that comes out. Most people never knew that about Luciano, that he'd done that. But as I mentioned, he's working with doing heroin deals with Jewish mobsters. So one of the things Charles Lucky Luciano was famous for is that he disagreed with the old school Sicilian guys, the Mustache Petes, about that. The old guys wanted to keep everything in their own family.
Ethnically homogenous as well.
Yeah. Not necessarily their actual family, but just within their crime family. Whereas Luciano was like, well, no, if I can trust you, I don't care what your ethnicity or religion is. If I can trust you and we can both make money, let's just do that. I don't care.
It's MLK's dream, you know?
Right, yeah.
Equal opportunity offenders.
Yeah. We're in America now.
Yeah.
What's to stop us from just making money? So where he'd been friends with Meyer Lansky. So Meyer Lansky wasn't necessarily a killer himself all that much. Although, he wasn't. He was no shrinking violet. But he was sort of physically slight, but he was absolutely ruthless, and he was more like the brains behind the operations.
Yeah, he was the inspiration for Wolfsheim in the Great Gatsby as well. So he has some quite cultural staying power.
Yeah, I think that character in The Great Gatsby is also a bit of a
amalgam.
Yeah, yeah. There was also, I think there was also another character called Arnold Rothstein, who was sometimes called the Fixer, or the Brain, or the Big Bankroll. And Rothstein is the guy that is supposed to have, according to legend, to have rigged the 1919 World Series.
Oh, I have heard about this, yeah.
So he's like one of those guys. He's Jewish, but he was one of those guys from an earlier generation where he would, on the surface, was a completely legit business guy, but in fact was involved in loads and loads of organised crime. And he was one of those people that would sort of set up somebody like Luciano, set up someone like Luciano or Frank Costello or Meyer Lansky, and say, look, you young street kids that have got a lot of energy and balls, in order to get your organised crime going, if you need you need maybe some couriers and vans, and you need a bit of money to get going, because we'll talk all about prohibition in a moment. You need a bit of money to get your operations going. And you need a little bit of political cover. You need a word in one or two policemen's ear to sort of turn a blind eye. I can do that. I can fix all that for you.
Yeah, he facilitated all the infrastructure.
Yeah. Now, I do want a cut of everything, but you can't do it on your own. So anyway, Arnold Rothstein is thought of as he facilitated a lot of these early guys before they sort of took off in their younger years. So anyway, going back to Luciano and his connection with Jewish mobsters. Meyer Lansky had some muscle in his gang, a guy called Benjamin Siegel, known as Bugsy Siegel. And for a while, before they sort of got really big, they were called like the Lansky Siegel Gang. They called themselves, something like that. Anyway, there's a whole long story, whole load of lore about Bugsy Siegel. He like went on to have all sorts of adventures, sort of a crazy life. But he really was sort of a bit of a stone cold killer, where Meyer Lansky was much more just the brains of the operation. Bugsy Siegel would beat people up and shoot people a lot. I'll maybe talk about him a little bit later, but you could do an Epochs just on him. Do an Epochs on Meyer Lansky. On a lot of these figures could have a whole Epochs just on their own. There's so much information about them. They got involved in so many adventures. But anyway, just to know that Luciano could call upon Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel to do dirty work for him. Meyer Lansky was also, we're told, well, he was, sort of a successful person. He was, even though sort of to begin with, just a street kid, he actually had brains and nous enough to run operations, even run big operations, keep lots and lots of figures in his head. You know, one of the things the mafia liked to do, or still do, is not really have many records. Records are dangerous. You know, what are you going to do with records? Pay taxes?
Yeah.
Come on, forget about it. So, what you would want is someone that can keep lots and lots and lots of information just in their head, and be able to do very big calculations in their head on the spot and all that sort of thing. Keep lots of networks and things just in their head. And Meyer Lansky was sort of some sort of genius at that, it seems. But utterly ruthless as well, just calling out hits on anyone and everyone he wanted to. In the end, we think, almost certainly, greenlit the hit on Bugsy himself, his oldest buddy. In the end, sort of ordered his execution, probably. Maybe I'll talk about that a little bit at the end, towards the end. One other thing to mention is just pure corruption, where I mentioned Arnold Rothstein there. The idea that you could get the authorities, the police, judges even, prosecutors even, to sort of turn a blind eye up to an extent, or to just give you an easy time through the courts, or just to ignore your crime on all sorts of levels. Well, because there was loads and loads of corruption. There still is, but it was really bad in the early 20th century, really bad. There's this concept of the Tammany Hall system. Tammany Hall is literally a place, Tammany Hall. And I suppose, just to describe it ever so quickly, run a lot by actually Irish interests, Irish gangsters, quite a lot. It's an old cliche, isn't it? Like American police in New York in the early 20th century, all Irish.
Yeah, the fat Irish cop. Same with Boston, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Open up! This isn't this! All right, Rabbit, where's Rocky? Where's he hiding?
There's sort of some sort of Irish mafia going on. So, but Tammany Hall was, and that goes way back to the 19th century, into the deep 19th century. Basically, if you vote for us, if you get your immigrant communities to vote for us, we will then do all sorts of things on behalf, like turn a blind eye to your organised crime.
Oh, I've never heard of that happening.
Right, yeah. So Luciano and all sorts of Italian and Sicilian mobsters were completely bound up in the whole Tammany Hall system. So the Italians and the Sicilians and the Irish and the Jewish gangs all sort of worked together on some level. Also had wars with each other. It's not like it was all fun and games and it's all lovey-dovey. Also had loads of wars with each other. So that was part of the problem. That was one of the things that the Commission and Luciano did, was to decrease the amount of wars they had with each other. And I'll get into that when he sort of becomes sort of completely powerful. One last thing just to say about Tammany Hall and about the police and things. When we look back on it now, we think, how could they get away with it so much for so long? One of the things, you had the FBI, so, after World War I, J. Edgar Hoover, it was the head of the FBI. And during the 20s and into the 30s, it's funny that the FBI has been sort of deeply, deeply, deeply corrupt from day one. Very political.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.